All right. Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to PrimePay's monthly broker webinar series. Today's title is on preparing your clients for the impending audit. Yes, you've heard it here first. It's impending. It's not if, it is when. So we have much to talk about, and so I'm excited to bring you this content here today. Good day, everyone. My name is Steve Jackson. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Development and Channel Sales here at PrimePay, and we are thrilled that you are taking time out of your busy schedules to sit with us here today. Actually, many of you for many months and even some years have spent time with us each month, and as many of you know, we try to take a lot of the technical guidance that we get from month to month and be able to break that down into practical application, because what we ultimately need you or would like for you to do is to take this information and immediately be able to apply it, communicate it with your current prospects and or clients. And so we're thrilled to be able to go with this today and in this important subject and an area that I think many of your clients and or prospects are certainly dealing with on an ongoing basis. Let me just lay a little bit of the ground rules here for today. We have a lot of folks on the webcast here today, and so all your lines are muted. However, we do want to hear from you, okay? So what I'd like you to do as we go throughout the webinar here today, if you go into the Go to Meeting menu tab, there's a question area. You can type in your question, and then I will try to do my part, if I am able throughout the webinar, to be able to answer your question. If I am unable to, many times I am unable to get to it, but if I am, I will try to tackle it. If not, we will follow up with your question. We will strive to provide the answer that you are needing, okay, for that particular question. Many of the questions are not as general. They're very much more specific as to a specific client or need, and so we will get to you offline and answer those questions the best way that we know how. So please use that question box here throughout. I get a standard question that I do receive is, hey, are you recording this? Yes, we record all of our webinars, and we would love for you to access those webinars through our public channel on YouTube, which is our Broker Concierge channel. So just go into youtube.com, search for Broker Concierge, and all of, well, not all, but virtually all of our webinars over the last even couple of years is all posted right there, and you can view that at your leisure. For many of our Broker Concierge partners, for those of you who are participating in our Broker Concierge portal, our community portal, the slide deck is going to be available to you as well, so you will have this presentation as a slide deck. You'll also have the recording, and there's also always some BC exclusive type of material that we will try to get to you as well that pertains to the topic here today. So, as most of you know, I have a lot of content. I always bring a lot of content for us in this hour, which turns into sometimes a little more than an hour, but I'm going to try to hold it to an hour if I can. So as you look here, preparing your clients for the pending audit, let's dive right into the content here, the agenda here that I want to cover here today, and it's really focused on 4 areas. The audits that have occurred, I can't speak to every audit that a client will go through. That would take a tremendous amount of time, probably knowledge and expertise, which is far beyond what I am able to bear. But there are specific audits that are going on today and certainly in the future that pertain to health and welfare benefits. And that is the focus for today. And that is truly, as a broker, as a benefits broker and consultant, you have an opportunity to truly prepare your clients in a way that no other advisor can. And I really want to focus on these 4 areas. And there's a lot of content with each one of these, but it's just these 4 that I want to cover. So I want to focus certainly a lot on ACA, some of the audits that can or will occur due to just what the Affordable Care Act has brought forth. So I want to kind of cover those items. I do want to focus on ERISA, and really ERISA has been around a long time in regard to pension benefits, but I'm going to focus on the health and welfare benefit side of the aisle here for ERISA. Certainly COBRA compliance. There remains confusion in regard to how employers are to manage and administer that COBRA compliance. So let's talk about that, how you can prepare your clients in a better way. And then lastly here is non-discrimination testing. And I'm going to cover a few things there today that I think, a lot of employers today, I don't know if they realize the exact requirements that are there for the plans that they are offering. So I want to touch on these 4 things. At the end of the day, the goal here is to be able to give and grant you greater exposure and opportunity with your clients and prospects. If you can prepare them, I think a broker once said to me, if my client is happy, I'm happy, right? So here is a way, in this preparation, there's a way here to make your clients extremely happy, all right? So one of the things that first came to mind as I think about being prepared, I kind of go back to sports, and my children are in sports. I was in sports through college and everything, and so I kind of go through sports, and in sports you practice, right? The more you practice, or the greater effort that you expound in practice, the theory is, right, the better you are going to be in the actual game scenario, okay? And so as I was just thinking about the word practice here a little bit, I could not help but think about an individual here that, is somewhat beloved here in the Philadelphia area, and that is our own Allen Iverson, which in 2002, he was in a press conference, it's now made famous or infamous, where a question from the press was asked about, hey, you missed practice. You've missed now practice a couple different times, and Allen Iverson kind of goes on a rant of stating, kind of quote unquote, practice? You're talking to me about practice? I'm the MVP, and you're not even talking about a game. You're talking about practice. And so this whole rant about this particular press conference was around how little he put an emphasis on the practice side of things. And so I should have put probably a big circle with a line through it. This is not what we want to be because it is about that practice. It is about preparedness, and that's really what I'd like to try to focus on here today in regard to where a client preparation can actually enable a client to actually significantly increase your business, build trust and rapport, build greater dependency on you and your agency. And so let's go ahead and get started as we talk about client preparation and thinking about potential audits and concerns. We're going to first focus on the ACA side of the equation. Now, there was a great amount of confusion, and I've brought this up in our previous webinar last month. We certainly have talked about it before. But it has brought a tremendous amount of confusion to employers that a broker may be dealing with. If you think about an aggregated group, we're talking about a commonly controlled group. Now, the forms 1095, 1094, they specifically allow an employer to state whether they are part of a commonly controlled group. And so it's important that an employer understands how being a part of a commonly controlled group, how that's going to affect them from a reporting basis, but also more largely a penalty basis if they do not classify themselves as an applicable large employer when they are an applicable large employer, right? So as you prepare clients, in last month's webinar, I asked you to just think about some easy questions that you can ask to try to address this question. But as you are preparing your client, you need to fully understand, because as a client, as a broker, you're working with a particular employer, you may not have a knowledge that they are part of an additional larger commonly controlled group, right? You're providing the benefits for that particular entity. You know that they have 30 employees or whatever it may be, but you did not have the knowledge that they are actually a part of another, due to family situations or other corporations, they have common ownership in other entities. So when we think about the 3 types of aggregated ALE groups, it's these three items. It's a controlled group consisting solely of corporations, and I put the sections of the code here because, certainly they need to go to a tax advisor to get greater definition, specificity around these specific codes. But generally speaking, commonly controlled groups, they could be part of 414B. They could be a group of trades or businesses under common control. Maybe it's a MIWA or an association of some sort, so Section 414C. And then it could also, there'll be forms of aggregated groups where it's businesses forming an affiliated service group, so professional employee organizations, that could be formed under, this is under 414M, right? So it's very important that your client immediately knows whether under ACA, do they fit under one of these specific definitions? And I'm not going to go into that here today. We have kind of touched on that a little bit on the definitions here in prior webinars. But here's where the preparedness kind of comes into the equation. And what we're asking you to start asking your clients, or actually asking or doing, is do the math. Okay, begin to ask the questions on, okay, I see that you're an LLC or a partnership, and so we have this owner or another owner, two owners. What do they own? Do you own other entities that they also own? How does that relationship work? Okay, because that group of 30, which on its own represents a small group, under ACA, if they have common ownership, they really are part of an aggregated ALE group, and an audit could occur, and we've already seen some of that work in process where an employer felt, no, I have 30 employees. I'm not an applicable large employer. I don't have to worry about the employer mandate. And as we delved into it, they actually were part of a larger, commonly controlled group, and indeed, they were considered an ALE. So keep these two in mind. The members of an ALE group or aggregated group are treated as a single employer. So many times these commonly controlled groups, they're independent of benefits, meaning each entity is doing their own benefits, the eligibility, the waiting periods. They're each doing their own thing. One employer may not know what the other employers or those other entities are doing. But what they need to keep in mind in regard to ACA is that each member, each ALE, is treated as a single employer, which means that even that group of 30 is still would fall under that employer mandate, which would also mean then that penalties apply individually to each employer. Okay? So it's not, the penalties don't apply it to the whole or only to that entity that is above 50 within that commonly controlled group. That entity that might have 15 employees, 45 employees, each of those employer mandate penalties will apply to that. So small employers. So one thing that I think as you think about your employers, and I have mentioned this before, but a lot of times, again, the employers are not thinking along these lines. You must move beyond benefit eligible. Many times you're getting the census, you're getting the information as to whom is eligible for benefits within your organization. You need to ensure that you're looking at everything. I want to see your part-time, your all those equivalents that are outside of that full-time basis. So certainly look beyond benefit eligible. And then there's two things, that your group, your client that is a part of that commonly controlled group needs to do. Number one, Form 1094-C, the employer must identify all ALE members. So here is where, as you're helping and assisting the client, you want the client to begin to communicate with those other entities. Whereas, okay, maybe they met once a year to kind of give a annual review of their corporate objectives and goals and all that kind of good stuff, right? As of owners, but they need to begin to communicate now. Prepare your clients now so that they're communicating with those other ALE members. Why? Because they're going to need to put specific data of those ALE members on the 1094-C, and then number two, they must identify the authoritative transmittal. Who's the primary employer within this commonly controlled group that we're going to list as the authoritative transmittal, because one of them needs to be that primary reporter. It's not to say that that authoritative transmittal entity is reporting for all of those entities within the commonly group, but one needs to be stated, one needs to be chosen as the authoritative transmittal. Okay, so very important that your employers begin to do the math. Don't wait. And and keeping in mind that they do and perform that calculation based on the previous calendar year. So here in 2016, they're looking at those entities and those FTE calcs based on 2015. Okay, so very important, okay, that would happen. So controlled groups, we found here at PrimePay as we went through the reporting requirements, we had many employers at the very last minute say, oh, wait a minute. Before we create those forms, wait a minute. We have an entity in Utah that, I think we may need to include that in here, okay? And that happened on more than one occasion. And what transpired then after that is just a series of events that had to occur, catch-up types of communication that had to occur to bring that all together. And so you as a benefits broker can really open up the lines of preparedness better by talking about it here today. So control groups is one thing, but then we get into classifying employees, and you might sit here and say, Steve, all right, look, I mean, we're in benefits, we get it, yeah, class of employees. I understand, we get it, okay. Well, most employers have their own set of classification of employees. I'm not specifically talking about a class of employees such as union or management, department types of class, locations types of class. We're not talking about that type of classification. What most employers, and this sounds very simple, but many employers have their own way of classifying employees. They name them something different. They still feel that an employee who works 40 hours is considered a full-time employee, but anything less, you're not a full-time employee. I mean, maybe ACA thinks you are, but you know what? In payroll, you're considered full-time only if you work 40 hours a week. Proper classification is key, and this is where you can truly help, because this is a foundational item that moves through the ACA process. So as reports are needed, as audits are being had, this information is vitally important. Sounds simple, but you need to drive clarity based on this specific classification. So a lot of this classification will occur directly within payroll, okay? So full-time employees. Full-time employees are those employees that at the time of hire, they expect to work 30 hours or more on average each week, okay? If based on the facts and circumstances of that employee working 30 hours or more at the time of hire, they are considered a full-time employee. That needs to be explained to the employer. You need to explain that, believe it or not. Label that as a full-time employee. Now you have part-time employees. Part-time employees are just those employees that come in and they're going to work a fixed amount of time, but the fixed hours every week or month is going to be below 30 hours on average each week, or 130 hours for the month. So part-time employee is literally an employee that comes in and they're working 15 hours a week, period. Okay, part-time, no problem, easy. That's part-time. I'm going to get into the VH, the variable hour employees, here in just a second, so I'm going to describe that here just a little more fully. But the next bullet there is seasonal employees and seasonal workers. Now, I suggest you go and listen to my recording there from last month. I provided a definition between seasonal employees and seasonal workers. So think about this, okay, and I'm not going to dive into this here again. But the classification, classifying an employee the wrong way as a seasonal employee or as a seasonal worker, can greatly impact a couple things. One, could impact the calculation for the applicable large employer status. Okay. It could also impact whether an employer needs to measure or monitor that employee through a specific period to see if whether they are actually going to become eligible for coverage. So those two things, seasonal employees, seasonal workers, it needs to be labeled appropriately so that we actually can understand then how an employer, what their obligation might be given that specific definition. So there's certainly other classifications that an employer would use. I would suggest that they need to stick to those 4 basic types of items, okay? Now, so I've told you that because, you know, as you look at the 1095-C, you are supposed to, and even the 1094-C, actually, let me point to the 1094-C, an employer is obligated to put in all of the full-time employees counts and are supposed to put in all of the full-time equivalent counts for every month. And so that has to be listed. There's 2 columns on 1094-C that they have to list that. So an improper classification here, right at the start, right at when a new hire comes on board, can greatly impact the reporting requirement, and certainly an audit down the road that can occur, which I'm going to talk about, that could completely mess that up and cause confusion. So what I do want to talk about then is the variable hour. Where I'm going to focus here next is on employer notice program, okay? And this box that I just showed you here on the variable hour employees becomes very, very important. And you're going to prepare your client just greatly if you can get them through this requirement. So a variable hour employee, I get this question all the time from employers. So, well, I don't know. What's your definition? What's a variable hour employee? I don't even think I have any. Well, most employers have variable hour employees. And what a variable hour definition is, and I'm totally condensing this, but this is a solid definition, based on the facts and circumstances at the time of hire in which you've hired that individual. It is unknown if they would exceed 30 or more hours on average each week. So you think they're full-time, maybe, but the job requirement is such that, based on shifts and schedules and whatever it may be, they could work more or less. You just don't know. Okay? Well, this is nice because as an employer, if I'm not going to label them as a full-time employee, I don't have to offer them coverage right away, right? But and so I can just kind of bring them in. I don't have to offer them coverage, and they can become an employee. However, the requirement is real that each employer must measure each variable hour employee. And as you know, there's a new hire measurement period, which is often called the initial measurement period. Clearly, there's stability periods and admin periods, but we won't get into that. And then you also have a period that is set aside to monitor ongoing employees. And that's going to be done through those standard measurement periods. And so the main trigger here is to ensure or monitor to see if that particular VHE is working 30 hours or more on average weekly, or the bigger number that's out there is 130 or more hours. I mean, what the IRS will look at and what they've stated kind of time and time again as a guideline is really 130 hours. Is that employee going to work 130 hours each month? Why do we care? Because that triggers eligibility. And it's important for an employer to understand whether that specific employee has hit those specific triggers by the end or at the end of their specific measurement period, right? That eligibility is what triggers potential audit concerns, okay? So I have sensed from many employers that, if I get pinged, I'll do some research and hopefully I'll get them the answers that they need. But that's not how you prepare. That's Allen Iverson's way of preparing, not going through the practice. Here's a way for you to be able to prepare them so that when an audit occurs, they can easily share information and easily be able to appeal that specific type of an audit. So simple things to talk about, maybe not simple to do, but these measurement periods are vitally important for the variable hour employee. So that brings us to some potential, and I'm calling this an audit, and it's not an IRS, well, it's kind of IRS triggered, but it is, or will be enforced by the IRS, but this is really an HHS type of a focus, a marketplace-focused initiative. But ultimately, this comes down to where the IRS will get involved to understand whether you have penalty under the employer mandate or whether the individual has a penalty under the employer mandate. So what is this employer notice program, right? So ACA requires the health insurance marketplace to notify any employer of its employees who enrolled in marketplace coverage and received an advanced premium tax credit, or even you can go on further with a cost-sharing reduction. Okay, so that's what it's about. It's to, if the IRS is to enforce this, and if you have an individual that goes, they qualify for a subsidy for their premium, so they enroll in coverage. What the IRS wants to know is, well, I mean, is that individual eligible for that specific subsidy? So when is this happening? Okay, in 2015, actually HHS started to send out education content, information about this program. So they were trying to educate the market, the employers, in regard to what was expected. But starting in 2016, the health insurance marketplace is sending notices to employers whose employees received that premium tax credit in 2016. So, filing, right? Everybody has been filing taxes, filing that information. They had submitted information on applications. So if that employee receives a premium tax credit in 2016, employers can begin to receive this notice, this program. Well, Steve, who is actually going to receive this? Well, that's a very good question. So employers who have employees who receive this premium tax credit, so it's for employers who have those individuals or employees, but it's really for only those individuals who provided a complete employer address. So we sit here and go, okay, as an employer, all right, please, okay, this employee, they can't prepare any form completely, so I'm pretty sure they're not going to be able to provide a complete employer address on their enrollment for their insurance. So you might surmise that, okay, how many times will this actually happen? I don't know. However, if an employee did provide the complete employer address, that is going to be provided. So again, why is this all happening? Ultimately, the IRS is independently determining liability, and it's ultimately to enforce the employer mandate. Let's keep going on here. Okay, so let's keep talking about it. So how is this done? So as an employer, your employer has now received this notice. What's kind of the next, how is the employer supposed to move forward here with that? So an employer has 90 days from the date of the notice to appeal, to make its appeal, okay? And it's really looking for the employer to provide a couple of these things. Does the employer provide the employee access to affordable, minimum value, employer-sponsored coverage? And or can it provide details that the employee is enrolled in that employer-sponsored coverage? Okay, so it's the basic tenets of the employer mandate, where do you offer coverage? Do you offer affordable minimum value coverage? Okay, to those employees and to dependents, right? So the employer is going to need to provide language around what was offered or how that employee is enrolled in that coverage. And there is a specific appeal request form, and this appeal request form can be hunted down. You can search easily on Google in regard to this particular notice, so you can see that. So I've quoted this here to just reflect what this audit can entail, and it says this, and I've quoted: "Please use the space below to explain why this employee shouldn't have been eligible for the premium tax credit." And it kind of goes on from there, and it gives several lines for that employer. So think about this. If an employer, if you're not preparing yourself to look at a variable hour employee or a full-time employee and be able to easily state, full-time employee, that's easier, right? We don't have to measure them. We simply need to state they're a full-time employee, they work this amount of hours, I've provided coverage, and so forth. Relatively easy. For a variable hour employee, how will an employer quickly put this information together if they haven't prepared themselves ahead of time and in the previous year have been measuring that employee appropriately? And if they're using a solution, a tool, a resource, or at least being prepared, they could easily, in this section, describe why this employee is eligible or not eligible for that specific subsidy, right? So very important. So this appeal request form, it's amazing, but it just gives the lines for that employer to be able to provide information. Okay, so what happens next? So what happens once the employer has actually submitted the appeal, okay, back to the marketplace? It goes to a marketplace appeals center. They're going to do three things. It's going to acknowledge receipt of appeal, and secondly, the appeal is certainly going to be reviewed, all right? I love this line, but additional information may be required. So again, in the preparation, if you're doing what you should be doing and assisting and helping, supporting your clients, through this, the employer should have given adequate, solid information, comprehensive information that would state it one way or the other, okay, for that employer. Once that is done, step 3 will be that an appeal decision notice will provide the outcome to the review, and that decision notice will be delivered to the employer and to the employee. So a couple things, right? No penalties are divvied out, no one did anything wrong, or a specific penalty to the individual may apply, or a penalty to the employer may apply through that. One of the questions that had come up is, are these notices being sent only to those employers who have been identified as an ALE? If that individual has provided an employer address, then that notice is going to be sent to that employer if they qualified for a subsidy. All right? So there's many small employers out there, right? Easy peasy, right? You can, hey, I'm a small employer. I'm not an applicable large employer. I didn't have to provide coverage or whatever the case may be. I don't even have to measure these employees, right, as a small employer. But certainly they will receive this notice, all right? So, I list all of that to ultimately say, okay, it can cost the employer greatly if they fail to do some of these specific items, right? But as you now see in this employer notice program, doing some of the little things first, the classification of employees, the measuring, just the ongoing measuring, or even right out of the gate, just making sure that you are considered an applicable large employer if you happen to be part of a commonly controlled group, it's just, if you do those steps first, you can adequately and more easily go through that employer notice program. Because again, this isn't if it's going to happen. They're going to get a notice, okay? Many employees are receiving subsidies. So the other key piece to this, right, is on just the penalty phases. So whatever. What if they don't want to participate? They don't want to do that work ahead of time. Maybe they want to be an Allen Iverson and whatever. Are you talking to me about practice? But the employer mandate, penalty A, right? So these are, you guys know these here. Penalty A is at $21.60. Penalty A is if you do not offer any coverage, right? And so now we're looking at the number of full-time employees minus 30, not the 80 that was there in 2015. And then that's times 180. That's based on a monthly basis there. Penalty B is if you're offering coverage, but you're just not offering affordable, minimum value types of coverage. Then you could actually get hit per full-time employee who receives a premium tax credit. Okay, and so that's a lot less, but still kind of costly. But these penalties are pretty real, right? And you can head these off by just doing some simple things there and preparing your clients a little better beforehand. I'm not going to go through these as far as each one of these reporting requirements, but the IRS has provided some relief for this year, for the 2015 return year. And I think all in all, at the end of the day, the IRS has made mistakes. Employers have had, difficulty and frustrations through this. So I don't see a lot of penalties levied for these first-time users of the reporting requirements. However, that will be sunsetted, okay? And for the 2016 returns, these specific penalties, this exposure is real. And so keep in mind, although there could be an extension for next year, I've not heard of that, but certainly an IRS could do whatever they want to do. But you need to get your clients prepared to distribute Forms 1095 to their employees by the end of January of next year, and then to file appropriately, whether it's electronic file or manual file by the end of February or the end of March. You got to get them on that deadline because that's the present deadline that's there. So this isn't easy. There's a lot of little moving parts here, but there are ways that you as a benefits broker can truly maximize and prepare a client for the many things that are coming their way. Instead of having your client receive this employer notice from the marketplace and going, what the heck should I be doing next? What information do I need? Prepare them. If you do all those little things ahead of time, it will easily be able to transfer onto that notice. ERISA. ERISA has impacted employers greatly in the pension market for decades, right? Since the early and mid-'70s, ERISA, as it became law, has impacted the pension area, the 401ks, tremendously. It wasn't really until ACA kind of started to, it is very focused on health and welfare benefit plans, and also the need to drive some revenue for this program and this regulation, that ERISA started to become more widely used, where we're seeing greater increase in activity of audits from ERISA, Department of Labor, specifically on the health and welfare benefit side of the aisle. Now, what I will say is this: as I show that picture there of a guy trying to get the dart on a moving target, in my opinion, there is no more moving target, whereas in the past, years ago, does an employer even need to care about ERISA compliance for their health and welfare benefit plans? I think most of us on this call here would say, no, there's no issue. I would not even worry about it. Don't waste your time. But the Affordable Care Act has put this enormous focus on ERISA and these benefits. And the Department of Labor has gone out and have said that if you look at 4 businesses today, that 3 out of 4 employers are out of compliance with ERISA, okay, with just ERISA. So the Department of Labor is sitting, in knowing that, the Department of Labor has increased their audit activities to certainly search those 3 out of the 4 that are out of compliance. And they are targeting not just the large entities, they are targeting those employers, those smaller employers, because this ERISA affects employers of all sizes. This is not ACA 50 or above or 50 and below, or COBRA 20 and above for federal. ERISA impacts any employer that has 2 or more or who have a group health plan. Let me put it that way. And so ERISA impacts everyone. And so you can begin to prepare your clients if that fraction holds true, this percentage, 75% of employers are out of compliance. Then just think about your client base. And let's now think about how can we best prepare them to ensure that they get through any audit cleanly and quietly, right? Without much touch. So if we think about this, for most employee benefit plans, ERISA, and I'm not, we're not taking these moments here today to take a deep dive into each one of these things. But ERISA requires detailed disclosure to covered individuals. If you think about COBRA just over the years and the requirement today, as you hire a new employee that's going to be covered, certainly under insurance, you need to provide them with an initial rights notice letter, right, for COBRA. It tells them and explains their benefits, what's available to them under that continuation of coverage. Very important to disclose that information. Well, ERISA is a document-driven type of a compliance requirement, and so they've, a strong emphasis is on disclosing details of your health and welfare benefits to those covered individuals, which would include employees and beneficiaries. Now, for some or many larger employers, there may be a detailed reporting through Form 5500, which certainly is a requirement that's there every year based on your size. But there's also this strict fiduciary code of conduct on plan sponsors and administrators. And so these three things are the key variables for ERISA, okay? Very simple to state it here in a bulleted fashion, but maybe not as easy to fully understand. So what is the requirement, okay? So the requirement is this. An employer must, if they have a group health plan, a health and welfare benefit plan, then they need to have documentation supporting it under the ERISA requirements. And so you generally would see a plan document. That's not a insurance certificate. It's not a benefit summary from the carrier. This is a specific document that could be separate, kind of just a standalone, if you will, or could be a wrap or umbrella document that incorporates several of the health and welfare plans into one plan or document. But a plan document is very important from an employer level, and it provides great specificity of how ERISA is impacting their specific plan. The second item there, and it's probably the most important, is this summary plan description. And you guys are familiar with SPDs, certainly over the years with FSAs and Section 125 plans and Section 105 plans. But it's the same for ERISA. And the SPD is that employee piece. It's that COBRA initial rights letter, right? It's informing that employee what benefits are being provided, their waiting periods, eligibility periods, just all the little nuances and notices and disclosures that are very important under ERISA. And within 90 days of being covered, they need to generally have that summary plan description in hand. Now, there's also other ERISA items. There could be changes, amendments, kind of mid-year that need to be made. An employer would need to provide a summary of material modifications or an SMM. If required, there would be 5500 filing, and generally what's making that a rule would be if you start with 100 or more participants at the start of your plan year, yep, you are going to be required to file a 5500. And again, a 5500 is not that crazy of a job or task, but it is a responsibility and a requirement that must be made. If a 5500 is filed, then you generally are going to have a summary annual report, just kind of detailing what that filing kind of summarizes, what that plan is all about. And then you also have other notices that fall under ERISA, which you're familiar with, which is the SBC, the Summary of Benefit Coverage, which you see all the time. But also you have WICRA, the Women's Healthcare Rights Act notice. You have the Qualified Medical Child Support Order notices that are part of ERISA. Certainly you have other ACA types of notices. We don't have to get into every single one of those. This requirement, what an easy way for you to prepare your clients by simply asking some simple questions. So, can I take a look at your summary plan description that you provide on your medical plan? And then be quiet and see what they deliver. Most of the time, they're going to thinking that that's their plan, but clearly that is not a plan document. They might also then show you that benefit summary of their medical plan benefits, but that's just the summary of the plan. That's not an ERISA summary plan description. So there's some easy things that you can prepare your clients ahead of time, start asking the right questions to ensure that they are adhering to these specific ERISA requirements. Now, the failure of noncompliance under the ERISA side is very steep. You've seen many cases that have come out of the pension benefit area that are very large numbers. But when you think about the general enforcement provisions, it basically allows a suit to be brought where no document exists. So if there's no document, you're starting off with a major a major issue, because as you see there on the third bullet, failing to provide a copy of the SPD within 30 days of a request, or certainly based on open enrollment and so forth, it can equate to $110 per person per day. So if you had 100 employees that failed to receive an SPD, and it was a year ago, it will be $110 times 100 employees times, right? So the days that they did not receive that specific SPD, and my mind cannot quickly think up what that answer is, but I'm coming to a very large number there. So you can see how that can add up very quickly just because the employer does not have a specific, just as simple as an SPD. Now there's criminal penalties. There can certainly be civil penalties that can be assessed as well. But under the ERISA general enforcement provisions, you're looking here at $110 per day is generally what you're going to see, okay? Form 5500 actually can generate even more agita for an employer. I am very surprised on how many employers that we might bring on for our ERISA compliance services that are clearly an employer who should have been filing for some time and they haven't. Prepare your clients. Ask the question, if you've got a group that's close to 100 participants in the plan, they're very well likely to be needing to file Form 5500. And as you can see here, that there is no statute of limitations on this. So this is $10 per plan per day for each day that the plan is delinquent. So if the filing was due on the last day of the 7th month after the plan year ends, right, under the current stipulations, and they haven't done it for 7 years, you do the math. It's starting to get a little ugly, right? Now, there are many employers that are working through, and we would highly recommend utilizing the Delinquent Filer Voluntary Compliance Program. It's a program that is established by the Department of Labor for you to basically say, oops, I think I made a mistake. I think I've self-evaluated here, and I need to be filing, and so I'm going to go ahead and file through this program. By doing so, you are, although there's no statute of limitations, you are kind of capping more of a financial exposure for that employer, and we highly recommend employers to go through that process if indeed they find that they have not filed appropriately. So very important. Very easy process that you could take with your employers in preparing them for an ERISA audit. And that would be a Department of Labor audit specifically here for ERISA. And it really is coming down to a simple thing of getting a plan document, summary plan description available for each of the health and welfare benefits of that employer. COBRA. I'm going to fly through these last two here a little more quickly here because although these are very well known, right? COBRA, yeah, okay, I get it, Steve. But we continue to find where employers are not doing their part in regard. And a lot of it has to do with a little bit of a confusion around, well, now that the Affordable Care Act, now that Obamacare and the marketplace is available, I mean, do I really have to do this? I'm not required to do it anymore, really. I mean, they could just go there. I mean, that's easy enough. I don't have to keep, notifying them and giving them an option to enroll in my group plan when they leave me as an employer or have some type of qualifying event. So a lot of employers feel that this key requirement has been removed or reduced, and that's clearly not the fact. So what is the requirement? So this is no duh here, okay? An employee loses employer-sponsored coverage due to a qualifying event. Happens all the time, every day. There's been no change from ACA that would impact that statement by any stretch. And then the second component, right, under COBRA, just thinking about COBRA, that individual may now elect to continue that group health plan coverage and do so for unlimited time, right? So we got 18 months, 36 months based on the qualifying event that happened. So that there's been no change. That requirement through ACA, even though ACA has come on board, has not impacted that specific requirement. So very simple, but prepare your clients by ensuring that they are actually managing that aspect. Now, this is an area that we find that has continued to cause problems for employers because they are not looking at all plans. Okay, there are some COBRA administrators that may only administer the plans that they offer. I mean, many insurance carriers might perform COBRA administration, but it's just for their products. Well, you better make sure that the employer is offering COBRA to the other group health plans that they offer, right? So what plans are being affected? These are the standards. No changes here from ACA. Medical, dental, vision. You could also have, potentially, certain EAPs, discount wellness programs, and even on-site clinics that could be considered qualified, which you would just need to base that on the information provided from the carrier and the product and so forth to determine that. Generally, no, but many times they can be. But the two that are often left out, believe it or not, is the Health FSA and the HRA, Section 105 plans. So you fail to remember that an HRA, it's a reimbursement program. Yeah. It's a Section 105 plan, and so these are considered group health plans that are qualified for COBRA. So generally speaking, the Health FSA is only offered as COBRA, and this is within plan documents, right? So it does need to be stated within the plan document, but generally how it would work is that if the employee has a positive balance in their Health FSA account, then a COBRA would be offered. Under an HRA, every year the HRA COBRA premium would be determined based on that group's utilization of the HRA. And so that changes every year based on the utilization. And one note, this is just a note that I put in here, but because I've gotten this question before, is the Cadillac tax. The Cadillac tax is not based on the total maximum reimbursement that is offered. It's based off of the COBRA premium. So it's important that your employers are determining that COBRA premium every year, but what's more important is for you to prepare your client to ensure that the HRA is listed on their qualifying election letter as a COBRA qualified plan. All right. So the main emphasis here with COBRA and ACA is that ACA did not eliminate COBRA. In fact, it actually, it probably put a fortress around it and made it stronger, here to some degree. And although an employee has maybe another choice through the marketplace to buy coverage, the employer-sponsored coverage still needs to be offered. So the key things to remember is that new participants must be notified of their rights. That's the initial rights notice letter. COBRA must still be offered when a qualifying event occurs. There are new rules. A lot of those are centered around special enrollment rules or changes that can occur. For COBRA, there's new rules that do coordinate COBRA in the marketplace. And there actually is a new COBRA qualifying election letter, QEL there, that adds additional language about the marketplace within that letter. Your employer should be utilizing that language, okay? So it did not eliminate COBRA at all. Qualified beneficiaries who are eligible for or enrolled in COBRA, are generally still eligible for the marketplace, but they have a choice when they leave that employer, and that's really the key thing. Non-compliance is huge for COBRA, right? You guys have seen for years the Department of Labor, the cases, the civil and the federal cases for employers, and the penalties have been enormous, not just the Department of Labor penalties, but the civil penalties that ensue afterwards, after that has actually come to be. But what's important to note, and where you can greatly prepare your clients is that the Department of Labor is not the only enforcement agency for COBRA. It's also the IRS. The IRS can also impose excise taxes on that employer for failing to offer coverage in the way that it is designed and required. So the Department of Labor can impose penalties of $110 per qualified beneficiary per day. The IRS can impose excise taxes of $100 per qualified beneficiary per day, or $200 per family maximum per day is what that would equate to. So the numbers can get very large, and the IRS has provided, even a checklist of sorts that would tell the employer, hey, if I'm coming in for an audit for COBRA, here's what I'm looking for. here at PrimePay, we have a way for you to be able to present that to an employer, and I think you can best prepare a client for COBRA and the expectation of an impending audit by going through a checklist and ensuring that they are checking off, yes, I got this, I do this, I'm taking care of that through all of those steps. So very key. COBRA, not eliminated, but a very important requirement, and something here that you can truly assist them and prepare them in a really good way. So non-discrimination testing, we're wrapping up with this fourth item here on non-discrimination testing. And I pulled a quote from the Pirates of the Caribbean, if you guys follow that or watch that. But they talk about the Pirates Code, right? And they talk about it with such reverence. But there's a quote in there that says, well, it's more of what you would call guidelines, right? Not really actual rules. they're just guidelines. And I think, as I was thinking about non-discrimination testing, I think a lot of us, your clients, think in that same vein, right? Clients are sitting there like in the classroom, like that picture above, just raising their hands like, well, you know what? I mean, is it really important that I follow this? I mean, I know I shouldn't probably give highly compensated employees more than my non-highly compensated employees, but, I mean, you're just kind of giving us a guideline, right? Wrong. So, non-discrimination testing, there's three things, kind of the top three items that you can begin having discussions with your clients that I think will get them to start thinking a little differently in regard to non-discrimination testing. There are three things here, trying to keeping it simple here. Number one, non-discrimination testing is required annually. It's meant to be performed on an annual basis based on the beginning and end of your plan year to ensure that with each plan, in any plan year, that you are conforming to the non-discrimination testing requirements. So each plan, each year, would need to be tested, okay? And it's being tested each plan year to, number two, ensure equality. And I just had mentioned that here a little bit earlier. We need to ensure that the basic tenets of the non-discrimination testing is that you are not providing a benefit that's greater to the highly compensated employees than what you are giving the non-highly compensated employees, right? They want to see that, within the test, they're willing to give a little, but you can't have it get terribly out of whack. That you need to ensure equality each and every year. And then thirdly, to get your clients moving, is there are very high stakes for non-compliance, financial stakes. And the financial stakes are a little different than what I've posted earlier in regard to penalties. See, these high stakes actually probably impact the very people that you're working with at your said employer. And these people are considered highly compensated employees. They're the ones that are being impacted. So there are some high stakes for non-compliance, and it can actually impact your relationship if you don't prepare them for this particular item. So what is required? I clearly am not going to be going through these specific tests today, but it's merely to point out that these are not just, hey, add this together, subtract that, and what do you come up with here? No, there are specific tests. And the key tests that I'm talking about as it relates to health and welfare, group health plans, are under Section 125, your cafeteria plans, but also your Section 105 plans, which will include your HRAs, okay? So, again, it's required annually to ensure equality, and there's some high stakes here if they choose not to comply. So under cafeteria plans, you have those three tests that will apply. So cafeteria would be your Section 125 plans, premium-only plans, but also more, full-based cafeteria plans that your employers would provide. If they have a flexible spending plan, generally speaking, they will have a dependent care account, and there are 4 tests that need to be administered for just the dependent care account alone. So if you have a flexible spending plan with a health FSA, your pre-taxing premiums, and a dependent care account, there are 7 different tests that will be performed specifically here for under the non-discrimination testing requirements. Self-insured plans, HRAs. Now, there are sub-tests underneath each one of these, but there is a general eligibility and general benefits test that are applied specifically for HRAs. And we don't have the time to go through, each of those, but it's important that the employer provides or that performs this testing throughout the plan, not throughout the plan year, but before the plan year ends. Why? Because what happens if I fail? All right. What if I fail? What if I find out that I'm actually contributing more heavier to the highly compensated than the non-highly compensated? Well, the good news is this. if there's good news, you must pass as of the last day of the plan year, but it permits you to make adjustments all the way up until that last day. Now, you don't want an employer to wait until the very final day, right? Maybe administratively that can't happen. But if an employer is performing that test ahead of time, whether it's even a couple months before the end of that plan year, that would give them sufficient time to be able to make adjustments so that they can pass the test. So when you think about these non-discrimination tests that need to be made, it is really something done just yearly. They give you some flexibility when you give that test. You just need to make sure that as of the last day of the plan year that you are passing that specific test. So the penalties that are really there, if you're unable to make the changes in time, this is going to impact those highly compensated employees because the tax-free treatment of those benefits is lost. They don't get those tax-free benefits. So for premiums, for Section 125 plans, for HRAs, they don't get it. And that means that the salary reductions are treated as taxable income. And so no corrections are to be made after the year end. So it's important. So prepare your client. At the start of the year, at the start of the plan year, make sure that these specific items are on their calendar so that they know when they need to actually handle those specific tests throughout the plan year so they ensure that they are viable and will pass by the end of the plan year. So, how will you prepare your clients for the impending audit? I mean, I've covered 4 areas here that I think can greatly impact your clients from a financial basis, but also an administrative basis as well. And I want to just kind of summarize these here just a little bit here as I go through these 4. So under the ACA, as you prepare your client, the 3 things here that I'm just pointing out is get them to do the math. Get them to think outside of just not their entity. Ensure that they do not have any other commonly controlled. Question it. Really question, even if a carrier has said, well, no, I don't think that they're a commonly controlled entity. No. Dive into that further. Let's see from a tax advisor or of that client, let's ensure that they indeed are or are not considered a commonly controlled group, because it's very important that that client understands their position right out of the gate. So do the math. Ask about the classification. Real easy to talk about classifying employees, but that employer is going to need to get in the habit of making that classification on a regular and consistent basis as new employees are hired, whether it's through the Ben admin system that they're using or directly through payroll, through their payroll vendor. And then again, calculating all VHEs to determine their eligibility status is job number 1. They're going to receive an employer notice from the marketplace. Would they like to complete that process more quickly, or are they going to have to stop what they're doing and ensure that they get this information somehow in some way within the 90-day requirement? Okay, so do that ahead of time. Get them prepared, because the result will be this. They're going to get aligned with the employer mandate. They're going to be completely aligned, at least with how they want to work in that mandate, whether they want to pay or play. But it also provides instant validation, completing the appeals process for that employer notice program. And although the reporting requirement, we can't make it super easy, it is what it is, but we can simplify the process for them, that if they're doing the things ahead of time, it's going to make that process much, much better. As we think about ERISA is easier to kind of get our arms around, right? It's asking simple questions to determine kind of the employer status on that compliance, and I would start out by asking that simple question: hey, I'd love to see your summary plan description for that medical plan. What do you got? What are you distributing to your employees? And then see where they go from there. So take the conversation beyond just certificates of insurance, because most employers feel that that certificate is their ERISA plan document. Clearly not. Clearly not a summary plan description. So if you can ask those simple questions and prepare them appropriately, clearly you're going to avoid the penalties of noncompliance there. And actually, I love this second bullet. By having a summary plan description, you're clearly communicating to the employee the information that they need, right, to make decisions. It's about appeals notice language. It's about certain rights and opportunities for them. It's their eligibility language, waiting period, all of that good stuff that if the employer's providing it, I mean, that's the needed structure. That is there. And also, too, from 5500 filing, you can truly simplify the filing process by going through these in preparing your client in this way. COBRA, main thing here that I would point out is that you want to ensure that they're providing COBRA coverage to all group health plans. They could be utilizing an administrator that is just focused on a certain subset of those plans. Maybe not. Maybe it is completely overlooked. But ensure that they're providing COBRA for all COBRA qualified group health plans. And also, what kind of language? Have they updated their language? If they're doing things on their own, are they using the most recent language, including ACA, including marketplace language, including special enrollment types of language that is now needed within those notices? And the financial exposure for COBRA is huge. You see a lawsuit being published every week and some big number being exposed. You can certainly reduce the risk of high penalties tremendously. And you can also create a documentation for appeals. So when audits do occur from the Department of Labor or IRS, you are at the ready, or they are at the ready to handle it. Non-discrimination testing, the quickest way to find out if your employer is fulfilling this obligation is just asking, hey, I'd love to see the results of your test. Can I take a look at that? If they can't show you that, it's truly saying that they've not performed that test. Be thorough. Uncover all plans, as I had shown, that may require non-discrimination testing. Make sure that they're performing all of those tests. And keep in mind, with non-discrimination testing, as with most of these, but waiting will hurt the most. Ensure that they complete that testing and they pass by the end of that plan year. That clock starts ticking each and every plan year. This non-discrimination testing, I had mentioned it before, and I don't know if it sunk in, but failing a non-discrimination test impacts the highly compensated employees. Okay, and these are the people that you're probably working with within that organization, and so they're going to be directly affected, which can affect your relationship. So this is a way for you to prepare them ahead of time, so that this doesn't even come up. That you don't want to give them a "I told you so," but you do want to ensure that you've communicated this appropriately, and the NDT results can greatly simplify the audit experience as well. As I have done over the last few months in webinars, I've provided a SWOT analysis, and SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the reason why I'm doing this is to put an emphasis on some of these topics and subjects, and to get you to think more deeply about how you, as a producer, as a broker, and as an agency, whether these types of activities are these activities that you can benefit from, whether that's financial gains, whether it's just, it's just other personal and business issues that you want to achieve, your objectives, whatever that may be. But I think we found it very helpful to kind of reflect this, because some of you might be saying, Steve, are you serious? You want me to spend all this time talking to my clients about these areas? My word, shouldn't they know this? They need to do it, right? I tell you what, a big strength, what provides such strength if you do prepare your clients for the impending audit, is that it truly reflects on the breadth of your knowledge or your agency's knowledge and the expertise of your agency. Now, what you ultimately want is that you want the dependency on you and your agency to be increased, right? And providing this level of care, it shows that you empathize with the client. Hey, we're seeing audits as an agency with our clients. I want to help you. I don't want you to have any impending doom. I just want you to have an impending audit that's going to occur. So it does have the effect. It has real strength of your agency to not only increase client retention, that's a byproduct, but increasing the dependence of that client to constantly seek you out for that technical expertise is huge. The second area is weaknesses. Now, many of you, and comments that have been made after some of our webinars, has been on, liability. Well, Steve, holy cow, I don't know if my E&O even covers these particular items. I shouldn't go this deep. Well, I think what I have shown is actually not requiring you to go deep at all. There's simple questions that can be asked and addressed, and simply stating what the obligation is for that employer, that's a really good thing, right? But you're, that there's considerations for that. How deep, how far should you go with your clients? And that's really up to you. That's up to you to decide what is best. But, the weakness could be maybe your agency isn't prepared for this. Is your agency prepared to go this far? Does that mean you have to hire additional support or partner with someone else? Or, those types of questions that you need to address. Maybe it's something you just can't tackle right out of the gate, here today. The next item is opportunities, and by going down through each of these 4 items and preparing your clients for these impending audits, I am telling you, you are going to increase opportunities. But I also believe that you're going to increase opportunities in that ancillary specialty product area, where you're going to be able to sell more, to drive more through that particular employer, because you are caring so deeply about these implications of these audits that will occur here with your clients. Having this knowledge and expertise also gives you that ability to be able to seek larger client opportunities. I mean, absolutely bar none. And the last item that I show here is, because we love telling stories, right? Success stories, what have you. I mean, bringing a story to life with a new prospective client or current client, it is very impactful. And it would be great for you to be able to tell your clients, hey, been down this road before, had a client that went through this particular item, and I, quote unquote, I helped my client save X because of this particular process, or in how I helped prepare a client for these impending audits. Very powerful, right? The last is threats. And, you could, your clients could see a very significant financial burden, okay, if they were to not go through an audit as cleanly or as quietly. And I'm going to ask you this, not a threat in regard to necessarily, well, there's other people talking about it, which I do talk about that here, but what will that cost you if your client faces a huge financial burden of some kind? Maybe that impacts a new sale. Maybe that impacts a new opportunity for you to sell that ancillary product or that other type of a thing. So I actually would say that by not talking about it, not preparing your clients, it actually could cost you more. Could cost you a client. It's not your fault, per se, but could certainly cost you in a very revenue financial way. But then lastly, what I put there, if not you, then who? who better to talk about this? Payroll companies can talk a certain way. Here at PrimePay, we can talk a certain way. But you are at such a strong position with your client to be able to sit down and drive this process through. So really think about that. The threats, I think, are controllable here in this scenario. So a great opportunity, I think, here for you to be able to take advantage of preparing your clients in the right way. The last couple items that I just want to mention here, and appreciate your time here today, is want to continue to mention to our broker concierge partners where you've got some exclusive access here. We have a broker community portal that is available for you and is actually waiting for you. And many of you have already taken us up. You're using it, and it's very valuable. And I just want to point out that you can get access to the recording, to the presentation slides that I'm showing you here today. You can submit and track leads. You can view your client information with PrimePay. You have mobile access. There's a mobile app that can be used. And so your ability to interact and engage your PrimePay team is greatly enhanced through this particular portal. So we'd ask you to check us out if you haven't checked us out here already. We want to thank you for attending. There was a ton of information. As promised, I try to deliver a lot of content, but provide it in a way that I hope you can take little snippets. Maybe there's, maybe 2 out of the 4, 3 out of the 4 items that you can really grasp and get a hold of and really take advantage of here today. And I hope that, although not all the content may have been sitting on some good ground and, was planted firmly, there might be a few things that you say, Steve, wow, I hear you on those 5 key issues, and I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that today. So I hope that that's helpful. We can't thank you enough for your business with us and how many of you have partnered with us. We look forward to delivering more exclusive and just great educational content here to you in the coming months. Our next webinar is going to be a little change of date, but not the first Wednesday. But the Wednesday, June 8th, will be our next webinar. And our webinar will be focused on controlling cost. And it's going to be kind of honing in on how can you help minimize your client's financial obligations. That's a great conversation to have with your clients. So we hope you can join us. Save that date and time. You'll see some invitations here coming shortly, at least with that regard. There were many questions. We will absolutely get back to you personally, offline, with answers to those questions, and really appreciate the trust and support that you've given us. I want to wish you all well. Thank you. This will conclude our webinar here today. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Take care.